Thank you. My name is Joe McCoy, and I'm an alcoholic. And it's truly by God's grace and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that I found in a book called Alcoholics Anonymous that I'm sober today, and for that I'm very, very thankful. I feel the power of God in this room tonight, the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. There's always a lot of power when we get together as a group, and I can feel it tonight, and the fellowship is beautiful. And I got sober on the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I love the fellowship. Later on, I was to find the program. But I'm glad to be here tonight and hopefully in my right mind.
Hi, everybody. My name is Charlie Farman. I'm a very grateful recovering alcoholic.
Hi, Charlie.
Because I'm a member of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and with the grace of the power that I found in the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, haven't found it necessary to take a drink for 9,095 days today, one day at a time, and for this I'm very grateful. And Joe and I always like to say as we start one of these that we certainly do not consider ourselves to be the gurus of the big book. We don't consider ourselves to be the experts on anything at all. We're just two old drunks, met together several years ago, found we have a mutual interest in the big book, studied it together for quite some time. Hopefully we've learned a few things about it. And those few things we've learned about it, we just love to be able to share with other people. We do not attempt to speak for AA as a whole, and you are most certainly free to agree or disagree with anything that you hear us say this weekend. In fact, if you hear us saying things that can't be reconciled with what's in the big book, we suggest you don't pay much attention to that, and we'll try to keep those things to the bare minimum of it as we used to be. Thank God for that. If we're going to study our big book this weekend, which of course we are, I think it would be well if we would go back and look at just a little bit of the history behind it, get some of the ideas that the first members had to have in order to be able to put the book together for us to use it today. And normally when we do that, we go to the foreword to the second edition, and we go to the last paragraph on that page, Roman numeral 15.
You know, in the foreword to the second edition, I like this foreword to the second edition. It's got a lot of history in it. For instance, in the foreword to the second edition, I found out two or three things in this foreword. One, in all of Bill's writings that I've read, Bill always describes what the problem is. He gives us a solution to that problem, and then he gives us a plan of action to carry out the solution that he just told us about. So here in the foreword to the solution, we're going to find out what the problem is and where it came from. We're going to find out what the solution is and where it came from. And then we're going to find out the plan program of action and where it is and where it came from, and some other things, all in the foreword to the second edition. So at the bottom of the page it says that the sparks that was to flare into the first AA group were struck in Akron, Ohio in June 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker and an Akron physician.
Of course, we know the New York stockbroker is this fellow we call Bill Wilson. The Akron physician was Dr. Bob Smith. Now, I think we're treating old Bill pretty good when we call him a New York City stockbroker. He really wasn't. He was a New York City stock speculator. He made his living out of selling fast-talking to slow-thinking people. He was a real con artist and a real alcoholic. We don't want to take anything away from Bill because he was a great man. But I think we all need to understand he was an alcoholic just like all the rest of us. He was prone to do the same things the rest of us did, prone to make the same kind of mistakes that we did. And I think when we see that about Bill, it's going to be easier to understand the book because, after all, he is the primary author of the book.
6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend who'd been in contact with the Oxford group of that day.
Later on, as we get into Bill's story, we're going to see where he had what he always called a vital spiritual experience in the town's hospital in New York City in December of 1934. But before Bill had that vital spiritual experience, certain things had to take place in his life. One of those things was this meeting with the alcoholic friend who had been in contact with the Oxford groups of that day. And we know the alcoholic friend to be a fellow named Ebby Thatcher. And we know that Ebby came to Bill during Bill's last drunk and sat down with Bill in Bill's kitchen and gave him what turned out to be two very, very important pieces of information. He said, Bill, people like you and I who have become absolutely powerless over alcohol, if we are to recover from that condition, we're going to have the aid of a power greater than we are, the aid of a power greater than human power, period. And he said, I've been attending meetings with a group of people called the Oxford Groupers. And he said, they promised me that if I could have a vital spiritual experience, that during that experience I would find the aid of the power greater than human power, and I would be able to recover from alcoholism. When he told him he needed the vital spiritual experience, he gave him what later turned out to be the solution to alcoholism. And he also said, these people have outlined for me a practical program of action. And he said, they guaranteed me that if I would work that little program of action, apply it in my life, I would have the spiritual experience. He said, look at me, Bill. It's been 2 months since I've had a drink. Now, Bill knew about Ebby, and he knew how Ebby drank. And he always said, if I ever get as bad as Ebby Thatcher, I'm going to quit drinking. But here's Ebby Thatcher sitting in his kitchen, 2 months sober, and Bill's sitting there about 2/3 drunk. And what Ebby had to say to him really made an impression on Bill. He gave him the solution, the vital spiritual experience. He also gave him the practical program of action necessary to find that vital spiritual experience, which came from the Oxford Groupers of that day.
He'd also been greatly helped by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism, who is now counted no less than a medical saint by AA members, and whose story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages. And from this doctor, the broker had learned the grave nature of alcoholism.
Again, when we get into Bill's story, we're going to be able to see where as far back as the summer of 1933, Bill was placed in the town's hospital for withdrawal from alcohol by Dr. Silkworth. And Dr. Silkworth sat down with Bill and explained to him his ideas about this thing called alcoholism. He said, Bill, I don't believe alcoholism is a matter of willpower. I don't think it's moral character, and I don't think sin's got anything to do with it. He said, I believe people like you are suffering from an illness. And he said, I believe it to be a twofold illness. He said, I believe you have become physically allergic to alcohol, and that every time you take a drink, something happens in your body that produces an actual physical craving that demands more of the same. And he said that craving is so strong that after you once take 1 or 2 drinks and the craving is developed, then you can't stop drinking and you end up drunk and sick and in all kinds of trouble. He said, also, I believe you have developed what we call an obsession of the mind. And he said an obsession of the mind is an idea that overcomes all ideas to the contrary. And it doesn't make any difference how badly you want to stop drinking. From time to time, your obsession of the mind is going to tell you that it's okay to drink. And believing that it's okay to drink, you'll take a couple of drinks. You'll trigger the allergy, the physical craving will develop, and you'll be unable to stop drinking. He said you can no longer safely drink because of the body. You can no longer stay sober because of the mind, and you have developed a hopeless condition of the body and the mind known as alcoholism. And that day, Bill understood what his problem was. Because you see, prior to that time, he had thought it was willpower. He had thought it was moral character and sin. Why would he not? That's what everybody had told him up until that date. But when Dr. Silkworth gave him his description of alcoholism, for the first time, Bill understood what his problem was. But we also know that that was not enough for him to overcome his alcoholism, because he got drunk again and went back to the towns in the summer of 1933, and then he got drunk again and finally went back to the towns in November of 1934. Now, in 1934, he went back in the summer, and then he went back in November. So if the knowledge of the illness or the problem had been enough, Bill would have recovered a long time ago. It's only after Ebby brought him the other 2 pieces of the puzzle that Bill was able to recover from alcoholism. He got the problem from Dr. Silkworth. He got the solution and a program of action from Ebby. And based upon that, he was able to have his spiritual experience and recover from alcoholism.
Ebby began to take Bill to these Oxford group meetings. And the book said, though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford groups, he was convinced of the need of moral inventory, confession of personality defects, restitution to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of belief in and dependence upon God, which were the 6 tenets of the Oxford group, which was later on expanded into the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. And Bill did, like so many of us did when he was after his spiritual experience, he liked this idea of being helpful to other people. And Bill began to go out into the bars and drag people off the bar stools and take them to those Oxford group meetings. Now, they didn't want to go, but he took them anyhow. You see, he knew they were alcoholics. He seined them up out of the gutter, and he began to tell them about his giant spiritual experience that he had, and that they would come with him and go to the Oxford group meeting. They too could recover from their alcoholism through having this giant spiritual experience. And this worked, and he tried this for about 6 months. And after 6 months, he looked around one day, and he found that there wasn't anybody staying sober through all this activity except himself. So he went to Dr. Silkworth and said, Dr. Silkworth, I've been trying hard, very hard, trying to help other people stay sober the way that I did. And Dr. Silkworth said, yes, I've heard about some of your antics, some of the things that you're doing, trying to cram this spiritual experience down the throat of an alcoholic. He said, you can't do that. They'll just puke it right back up, you see. He said, why don't you do for them what I have done for you? He said, why don't you tell them about the illness of alcoholism? Talk to them about the physical allergy and the mental obsession. Explain to them the malady and why they're so sick. Explain that to them. And if they accept that, then maybe you can talk to them about spiritual experiences and spiritual awakenings. And I said, now prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic could help an alcoholic. But he had succeeded only in keeping sober himself. See, all this activity of trying to help other people stay sober was keeping Bill sober. Nobody else was getting sober, but Bill was staying sober, and that's one of the keys to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. He said the broker had gone to Akron on a business venture, which had collapsed, leaving him greatly in fear that he might start drinking again. He suddenly realized that in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic. That alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician.
And probably all of us know the story of Bill going to Akron. And while in Akron, he was there on a business venture. And he and some other people were engaged in a proxy fight to take over one of the companies in Akron. And Bill's going to get to be the president of the company. Now, while there, the proxy fight fell through. And Bill is standing in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel. All of his friends had left him. He was counting the money that he had in his pocket, and he knew he didn't even have enough money to pay the hotel bill. And he was very low and very sad and very depressed. And he looked through a door off the lobby into a bar. And probably the lights were low in that bar. And I imagine the music was playing, the laughter was great, and the smoke was thick. And he said to himself, I believe I'll go in there and have a soda, and I will be with people of my kind, and I'll feel better. But as he started through the door for the first time, his mind told him, Bill, you can't do that. If you go in there, you're going to end up drunk. And in desperation, Bill remembered how back in New York City, even though he had never helped an alcoholic, every time he had tried, he himself had felt better. So he made a few phone calls, came in contact with this lady named Henrietta Seiberling, who set him up with a meeting with Dr. Bob. Now, our book tells us that this physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcohol dilemma, but had failed. When Bill got there with Dr. Bob, he was surprised to find out that Dr. Bob was already a member of the Oxford groups in Akron, had been for approximately 3 or 4 years. But he had never been able to apply their program to the depth necessary to recover from alcoholism, because he didn't know what was wrong with him. He knew the solution, he knew the program of action, but he didn't know the problem. You see, he thought it was willpower. He thought it was moral character. He thought it was sin. Why would he not? That's what everybody had told him up to that time. But when Bill sat down with him and began to talk with him about the physical allergy to alcohol and the obsession of the mind, for the first time, Dr. Bob understood what his problem was. And Bill did it by not talking to Dr. Bob about Dr. Bob's drinking. He said, Bob, let me tell you about my drinking. And as he sat there and he talked about the many, many times that he'd have a drink or two, intended to go home after that, and something happened and he couldn't stop drinking, and he ended up going home a day, a week, or a month later. And he said, there's a doctor in New York City named Dr. Silkworth that told me this is a physical allergy to alcohol. And he told me that when I put that alcohol in my system, it developed that physical craving, and I could not stop drinking. And he said, whenever I found out what that was, for the first time I understood why I can no longer safely drink alcohol. And Dr. Bob said, hey, that's exactly what's been happening to me. He saw himself through Bill sharing his story with him. And then as Bill talked about the obsession of the mind, and he probably said to Bob, he said, Bob, I've got lots of willpower. He said, I've always been able to do anything I've ever wanted to do on my own willpower. But he said, when it comes to alcohol, it seems to not work. Because he said, I'll swear off drinking, never going to take another drink as long as I live. And 2 hours later, or 2 days later, or 2 weeks later, I'm sitting in a bar drunk, and I'm asking myself how I got there that time. And he said, this same doctor in New York City told me this is an obsession of the mind. And he said, because of that obsession, I'll never be able to stay sober on my own strength unaided. And Dr. Bob said, hey, that's exactly what's been happening to me. He was able to see himself, both his allergy and his obsession, through Bill sharing his story with him. When the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and his hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never before been able to muster. He sobered never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950. And I think this is one of the first great miracles of Alcoholics Anonymous. This old conning, speculating New York City stock speculator sat down with a well-trained surgeon and explained to the surgeon what was wrong with his body and his mind. Normally the doctor would have said, who in the hell are you to be telling me what's wrong with my body and mind? But you see, Bill didn't tell him that. He told him what was wrong with Bill Wilson's body and mind, and Dr. Bob identified and bought into it immediately. One of the first great miracles of AA. This seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. One drunk talking to another. It also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery. During that meeting, they learned the two basic things our fellowship has been founded on ever since. That one drunk can affect another as no non-alcoholic can, because we can identify with each other. And also that strenuous work, one with another, is vital to our recovery. Remember, Bill was just about to get drunk. Thank God he never had to take that drink, nor did he ever have to take a drink either from that day on. So I think the first great things happened during that meeting, the two very things our fellowship are really founded upon.
Late one night after Dr. Bob got sober, he and Bill were talking. And Dr. Bob said, well, Bill, I guess if we're going to do this thing, we better go. If we're going to go through this thing, we better go ahead and do it. He said, what are you talking about? He said, we better start working with other alcoholics. And he said, I think you're right. So the next morning, Dr. Bob called the Akron City Hospital and asked if they had a drunk down there, asked to speak to the head nurse, and asked her if she had a drunk down there that they could work with, because they thought they had a solution for this drunk's problem. And of course the nurse asked, well, Dr. Bob, have you tried this solution on yourself? You see, she knew that he too was a drunk. And he said, yes, I have, and it works. I'm sober. And she said, well, yes, we've got a corker. He's just beaten up one of the nurses, and we're putting him in a private room. Now, you remember way back, some of you remember back in the hospitals in those days, they had wards in city hospitals. Ward meaning that there was 20 to 30 people in one wing of a hospital in one great big room. And when they thought you were going to die, they would take you off of the ward and put you in a private room. Well, Bill Dotson was over in this private room thinking that he was going to die from alcoholism, because they'd moved him off of the ward. And so Dr. Bob and Bill shows up, and they begin to talk to Bill Dotson, not about Bill Dotson's drinking, but about their drinking. They begin to tell him about the physical allergy and their mental obsession, and how it worked with them, and what happened to them when they were drinking, and what happened when they started drinking, and how the physical allergy worked with them, and the obsession of the mind that they had when they were not drinking. And Bill Dotson said that he was like that too, and he identified with that. So the next day he said, could we come back and see you tomorrow? And he said, yes, please. You two guys seem to know what you're talking about. So the next day they came back, and he was back on the ward, and this time his wife was with him. And he looked up as they come in, and he said, there they are, There those two guys are. I thought I was hallucinating. It is true. And here's it. They have a solution for alcoholism. And he got up and walked out of that hospital, and he never took another drink either. So now we have three people who know three things. They know what the problem is, they know what the solution is, and they have a planned program of action.
Of course, we see pictures in AA rooms all over the world called The Man on the Bed. And this represents Bill and Bob sitting down talking to AA number 3, Bill Dotson. And he's sober never to drink again up to the moment of his death. Now, this makes three people. They're in Akron in 1935, and they all know three things. What is the problem? What is the solution? And what is the program of action? They had all three applied the program of action, and all three had recovered from alcoholism. This work at Akron continued through the summer of 1935. There were many failures, but there was an occasional heartening success. You know, you almost have to go back to 1935 to really realize what's going on here. Remember, this is all brand new. And these guys really didn't know a hell of a lot about what they were doing that summer. And they would try something with a new person, and if it worked, they would keep it. If it failed, they would discard it and try something else. And one of Dr. Bob's favorite things was to fill them up with kraut juice. He knew there was some vitamins in that kraut juice that would build the body up and help them stay sober. And they tried that amongst many other things. And every once in a while, one of these guys would fall over dead. And I'd almost see Bill say to Bob, "Oh, crap, let's don't do that again, you know." We always give credit to Bill, Bob, the first 100. Maybe we ought to give credit to those they failed with that summer, too. They probably learned more from their failures than they did from their successes. When the broker returned to New York in the fall of 1935, the first AA group had actually been formed, though no one realized it at the time. Now remember, in 1935, these guys are all members of the Oxford group. And the Oxford groupers were beginning to have a little trouble with the drunks. The drunks like to stand around in the corner, smoke cigarettes, drop ashes on the carpet, and spill coffee on the carpet, and tell dirty jokes. The Oxford groupers wanted to be a little better high class of person. They really were not into helping drunks to that extent. The drunks were having trouble with the Oxford groupers. The Oxford groupers had a thing they called the four absolutes. Absolute love, absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness. The drunks were having a hell of a time being absolute anything except drunks. So already a little separation had begun to start taking place between the regular Oxford group members and the alcoholic Oxford group members. In fact, to separate them from the regular members, the drunks began to be called the alcoholic squad of the Oxford groups. So what Bill left behind him when he went back to New York that fall was the alcoholic squad of the Oxford group, which later turned out to be the first group of AA. But at that time, they were still members of the Oxford groups.
By late 1937, the number of members having substantial sobriety time behind them was sufficient to convince the membership that a new light had entered the dark world of the alcoholic. A second small group had promptly taken shape in New York. And besides, there were scattered alcoholics who picked up the basic ideas in Akron and New York and were trying to form AA groups in other cities. Still no AA, still just the drunk squad of the Oxford group members. It was now time the Southern groups thought to place their message and unique experience before the world. You know, later on, Bill went back to Dr. Bob and went back to visit with Dr. Bob, and while there, they began to count the numbers of people in New York that were staying sober. They began to count the number of people who were in Akron who were staying sober, and to their amazement, there was approximately 40 people between Akron and New York that were staying sober. They began to see, and Bill being the promoter that he is, and remember that Bill was a promoter, that he is, he began to see that a dark, a light had begun to shine into the caves where alcoholism was and where people were staying drunk and having all kinds of trouble. He began to see they might have a solution for those people. He began to think that maybe if they carried this message to the world or to the alcoholics, that maybe they too could enjoy the fruits of sobriety as Dr. Bob and Bill had. So they began to think how they might give this thing away, what they might be able to do to help other alcoholics stay sober.
One of the tenets, of course, of the Oxford group always was you're going to have to give it away if you're going to stay sober. You're going to have to help others. So there was never any question from the day Bill got sober as to whether we're going to keep this information for ourselves or not. Always the idea was, how can we best help the greatest number of other suffering alcoholics? And Bill and Bob began to discuss this. And maybe this is the first instance of the group conscience in AA, because they decided they didn't want to make a decision as to what to do with this information. They called a meeting of those there in Akron, and at that meeting there was a total of 18 people there. And the main topic of the discussion was, how can we best carry this to the greatest number of people? And they made that night 3 decisions. One decision was that they needed to build a chain of hospitals stretching all the way across the United States and Canada, so any alcoholic that needed withdrawal could be placed in a hospital for that purpose. In the 1930s, it was almost impossible to get into a hospital for alcoholism. Your doctor usually had to lie and call it something else. By the way, that was true in 1969 also when I got sober. It's only in the last few years that you could freely go in and out of hospitals for alcoholism, so they felt they needed those hospitals. I assume Dr. Bob is probably going to be the head doctor too. They also said what we need is to hire and train a group of missionaries. We'll send them out all over the country, and they'll carry this great message of recovery to any alcoholic wherever they might find them. And surely Bill was going to be the head missionary. Another thing that they had noticed in that little 2-year period of time, from 1935 to 1937, that the word-of-mouth message that they were carrying from one to another was already becoming changed, already becoming garbled. And they said, what we really need to do is take this information as we know it today, put it down in the written form, so that it will be preserved for the future, and alcoholics in the future will know it as we know it today. And they also said if we could put that in a book form, we could make a lot of money out of that book. In the 1930s, books were popular. That was before television. And there really was a time before television. Believe me, there was. And the Oxford group people had already had a bunch of books that they had written, and they were selling great. And they felt that if they could write a comprehensive book on alcoholism, stating what it really is, and what the solution to it is, and how to recover from it, that it would become one of the world's greatest bestsellers almost immediately. And then they could take the profits from the book and build the hospitals and hire and train the missionaries. Well, thank God it didn't sell very good in the beginning. And the only thing they managed to accomplish was to write the book. They never did make enough money off of it in the beginning to do anything with it, much less build hospitals, hire and train missionaries, which has turned out to be one of the greatest things that ever happened to us, of course. The book says this determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. Now, this book that I have in front of me is an 8th printing called the wartime edition of the big book that was printed in 1946. The first one came out in 1939. And this book was the one in 1939 was the first Alcoholics Anonymous that the world ever saw. It took them quite some time to determine on the title of the book. Some of them wanted to call it The Way Out, which would probably have been an appropriate name for it. Some wanted to call it various other different things. Bill, one time his ego got involved. He wanted to call it the BW movement. And they shot that down in a hurry. And finally somebody said, well, we are alcoholics and we're trying to remain anonymous. Why don't we name the book Alcoholics Anonymous? And this book was the first Alcoholics Anonymous that the world ever saw. Now, in this book, there is a program of recovery that the first 100 people, in 37 it was 40, by 1939 it was 100, that the first 100 people used to recover from alcoholism. Now, after the book was published, the little society, which had been nameless up until that time, now began to call themselves Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of this book. So in 1939, there's 2 Alcoholics Anonymouses. There's a book called Alcoholics Anonymous, which contains a program of recovery. There's a fellowship called Alcoholics Anonymous, which used the program of recovery in the book. And in those days, there was no conflict between the book program and the fellowship program. They were the same. But as the book began to fan out across the United States, Canada, and various parts of the world, the first person up here in Minnesota got a copy of it, read it, studied it, did what it said, recovered from alcoholism, and started an AA group. First person in California, same thing happened. First person in Texas, first person in Arkansas, first one in Mississippi. The great growth of the fellowship came from the book Alcoholics Anonymous. Nearly all the new groups in those days were starting from the book Alcoholics Anonymous. And for a period of time, the program in the fellowship and the program in the book stayed exactly the same. But somewhere down the line, people began to realize that maybe you can stay sober without having to do all these things in the book. Not recover from alcoholism, but stay sober. And they begin to say there's enough experience and strength in the fellowship that we can stay sober through the support of the fellowship. And they began to push the book to the side and started stressing more and more, come to AA meetings, come to AA meetings, come to AA meetings. And they began to depend more on fellowship than they did on program. And then after a while, somebody said, do you really need to take a full written inventory in order to stay sober? And somebody else said, do we really have to share all this with another human being? And somebody said, do we really have to get rid of all our character defects? And another one said, do we have to make complete amends to all of them? And somebody said, well, no, not really. You can treat it like a cafeteria. And you can take what you want and leave what you want, and everything will be okay. And then they begin to say, if you'll just come to 90 meetings in 90 days, it'll be all right. And finally, the program and the fellowship began to change until it reached the point where the program and the fellowship no longer resembled the program in the book at all. You know, some AA meetings you go to today, now I know this doesn't happen up here in Minnesota, but some places you go to AA meetings today, and if they didn't read the preamble before the meeting, you wouldn't know what kind of meeting you were in, because they talk about everything except alcoholism and recovery therefrom. They talk for a little bit about meaningful relationships, and then they'll talk about significant others, and then they'll talk for a while about chemical dependency, and then they'll talk about something else, and they talk about everything except recovery from alcoholism. We call those group depression meetings. You go in there, you're feeling pretty good. Halfway through the meeting, you're ready to kill yourself. There's no sense in going on living at all. See? Now, what we're going to talk about this weekend is not the program in the fellowship Alcoholics Anonymous. We're going to talk about the program in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. And slowly, what we've been seeing over a period of years is this fellowship is beginning to turn around and beginning to go back to the basic fundamental program of Alcoholics Anonymous in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, a few years ago, a few of us got together, including some well-known guys up here, and made a decision to come to Minnesota and do a big book study. And we wasn't even sure we could get enough people to make it worthwhile. And now tonight, look at the people in this room. And we see this taking place now in wholesale numbers throughout the entire United States, Canada, and various different parts of the world. And I think what happened is people in AA finally begin to realize that, hey, what we're doing isn't working. Fellowship alone is not sufficient to recover. There's got to be more to this thing. And they begin to pick up the book and look at the program in the book. And all of a sudden then, the thrust changed from staying sober to recovery from alcoholism. And now we see people going back and making wholesale recoveries in their alcoholism based upon the program in the book Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, I challenge everyone in the room tonight, when you go back to your meeting after this weekend, listen to what's going on, see what's happening, see how closely that program in your group is to the program in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. And it just might be, if enough of us try, we might get this thing turned around, and we might get our fellowship right back into the basic program which they left for us as our first legacy, and I think it's called recovery. not staying sober, recovery.
And I remember one time I went to my sponsor, Franklin Williams. Some of y'all know Franklin. He's in the hospital now and he's bedfast. He's not doing well. But anyway, I went to him one time years ago and I said, Franklin, my program's not working worth a darn. He said, what's the matter, Joe? I said, well, I'm mad at my wife and I'm mad at the people I work with and I'm mad at a few people in Alcoholics Anonymous because they won't mind, they won't do what I tell them to do. I'm just mad and my program's not working. And he said, well, Joe, your program's working just the way it was intended for. He said, why don't you try working the program? Now, there's a lot of difference between my program and the program that's in the book. Now, one of the things that we did as a fellowship, we took the steps out of this book and we put them on these little cards and we put them on the wall. And I like them on these cards and I like them on the wall. They're nice. But what people are doing today, and have been for quite some time, is they come into Alcoholics Anonymous with not read the book. We don't read anything that might help us, so we don't read it. And we look at the steps on the wall and on these cards, and we interpret what they mean to us, and we try to work the steps off the wall with no instructions. So the only piece of literature in Alcoholics Anonymous that gives us instructions on how to work the steps precisely is in the book, Alcoholics Anonymous. The only one, absolutely the only one. So we're trying to take our steps off the wall without any instructions. So let's don't take our steps off the wall. Let's take it out of the book. Okay?
Let's see how effective this thing used to be when the fellowship program and the book program were the same. Let's go over to Roman numeral 20, top of the page.
It said, while the internal difficulties of our adolescent period were being ironed out, public acceptance of AA grew by leaps and bounds. For this, there were two principal reasons: the large number of recoveries and reunited homes. See, that's exactly what's happened to me. I have recovered from alcoholism and my home has been reunited. And I would like to say this while we're here at this subject. In my area, in parts of my area, AA members are resentful at some of the Al-Anon members who are meeting in the same building at the same time. In my area, some of the Al-Anon members are resentful at the AA members and they're for meeting in the same building with them. And so there's a split between AA and Al-Anon, which I don't believe is not good, because this is a family illness. We got sick together. We must recover together. And I say to us, let's keep us together. Now, we're not going to preach anymore tonight. I hope you don't believe that.
These made their impressions everywhere. Of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried, 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25% sobered up after some relapses. And among the remainder, those who stayed on with AA showed improvement. Now, if my math is right, it tells me that 75% of them that came to AA and really tried our program recovered from alcoholism and stayed sober. I wonder what our recovery rate is today in AA. Is it 75%? Is it 50? Is it 25? Is it even 10? Probably less than 10%. Now, a lot of people today say, well, the reason there are not very many recovering is they're not really trying. Well, that's probably part of the reason. But the question is, why are they not really trying? And I think it's probably because nobody's showing them what to try. They used to. When a newcomer came in AA, an older member grabbed them, got them right into the program, right into the book, and walked with them and helped them take the steps, and they recovered from alcoholism. Today, the older members tend to say, well, these new people coming into AA, they don't know anything about AA, and I can't identify with them, so I'm just going to stay home. And when we do that, I think we abdicate our responsibility from AA and turn it over to the sickest who are the newcomers, and then we stand back and say, look at what they're doing to our AA. I think it's an old-timer problem. And I think we need to stand on our feet in our meetings and say, look, what you guys learned out there somewhere else is probably good information, but that's not AA information. Here's AA information. Here's the program of recovery. Let's work the steps, and let's recover, and let's let me help you work the steps. We used to call that sponsorship. I don't know what they call it today, but it used to be called sponsorship, and somewhere we've gotten away from that. And I really think the newcomers today could recover in the same percentages if they really tried the program, but they can't try it unless somebody's willing to stay there and help them do it. And if we run off and go somewhere else, and there's nobody there to help them do it, and naturally they're going to do what they know to do, and they're going to make AA a lot sicker than it is even now. So maybe we ought to think about those things. Now we're through preaching. No more preaching. Honest.